The door to the lawyer's office slammed open just as the clerk finished reading the inheritance terms, and Clara Tanner looked up to see a man in a dust-covered hat and trail-worn boots standing in the doorway like he'd ridden straight through a storm. His dark jacket hung open, his jaw was set hard, and his tired eyes locked on the lawyer with the kind of intensity that made the room go quiet. She pressed her ledger against her chest and felt her pulse kick because she knew exactly who he was. Harlan Briggs, the surveyor everyone said could finish the cattle drive if the railroad men didn't kill him first. And he was staring at the paper in the lawyer's hand like it held his last chance at peace. The lawyer, a thin man named Pruitt, cleared his throat and set the paper down with a hand that trembled just slightly. Harlan stepped inside and shut the door behind him with a controlled click that felt louder than a shout. Clara's fingers tightened on the ledger because she'd been trying to stay invisible in this room for the past 20 minutes, hoping no one would remember she was the daughter of the man who'd bankrupted half the valley 2 years ago. But Harlan's gaze swept the room and landed on her for just a heartbeat, and something in his expression shifted. Not recognition, exactly. More like he was filing her away as a variable in a problem he didn't have time to solve. Pruitt adjusted his spectacles and said, "Mr. Briggs, I was not expecting you until tomorrow." Harlan crossed the room in 3 strides and planted both hands on the desk. "I got your wire," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like he hadn't spoken much in days. "You said the deed to Whisper Ranch was contested. I need to know who's contesting it and why. Because I've got a herd waiting 10 miles out and a deadline that won't wait for lawyers." Pruitt glanced at Clara, then back at Harlan, and she felt her stomach drop because she knew what was coming. "The railroad filed a claim this morning," Pruitt said quietly. "They say the survey lines were drawn wrong and the ranch sits on their right-of-way. If they win, the cattle drive ends before it starts." Clara felt the air go tight. She'd heard rumors about the railroad men buying judges and burning out homesteads, but she hadn't realized Whisper Ranch was in their sights. Harlan straightened, his jaw working, and for a moment she thought he might overturn the desk. Instead, he said, very carefully, "Who filed the claim?" Pruitt shuffled papers and said, "A man named Gideon Cross." Clara's breath caught, because she knew that name too. Gideon Cross was the man her father owed money to, the man who'd shown up at their door 3 months ago, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a ledger that listed debts Clara couldn't hope to repay in a lifetime. And now, he was going after Harlan's land. Harlan turned and looked at her directly, and she realized he'd heard her sharp intake of breath. "You know Cross," he said, and it wasn't a question. Clara's throat closed. She wanted to lie, to shake her head and walk out, but something about the way he stood there, stripped of pretense and clearly at the end of his resources, made her nod instead. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He holds a debt against my family. A large one." Harlan's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with a kind of rapid calculation she recognized from her own sleepless nights. "And you work at the bank?" he said slowly. Clara nodded again. "I'm a clerk," she said. "I handle deposits and transfers. Nothing more." Harlan studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing whether she was a tool Cross might use, or a piece he could turn to his own advantage. Then he looked back at Pruitt and said, "How long do I have before the claim goes to court?" Pruitt folded his hands. 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe 3 if we file for an extension." But, Mr. Briggs, you should know that Cross has Judge Halloran in his pocket. If this goes to trial, you'll lose. Harlan's mouth thinned into a hard line. Then I won't let it go to trial, he said. He turned toward the door, and Clara felt a sudden wild impulse to stop him, because she knew what men like Cross did to people who got in their way. She'd watched her father crumble under the weight of that debt, watched him sell everything they had, and still come up short. Wait, she said, and her own voice surprised her. Harlan paused with his hand on the doorknob. Clara set the ledger on the desk and took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. Cross doesn't just want your land, she said. He wants leverage. If you fight him in court, he'll drag it out until your cattle starve or scatter. But if you give him something he wants more, he might let the deed go. Harlan turned back slowly, his expression unreadable. What does he want? He asked. Clara met his eyes and said the thing she'd been trying not to think about for 3 months. He wants me. The room went so quiet she could hear the tick of the clock on the wall. Pruitt made a small, shocked noise. Harlan's face didn't change, but something flickered in his tired eyes that might have been anger, or might have been understanding. He stepped back toward her and said, "Explain." Clara wrapped her arms around herself because saying it out loud made it real. "My father's debt," she said. $18,000. Cross offered to forgive it if I agreed to marry a man of his choosing. A business associate, he called him. Someone who needs a respectable wife and doesn't care that I come with nothing. I said no. But he told me the offer stands until the end of the month. Harlan's jaw tightened. "And you think if you say yes, he'll leave my ranch alone?" Clara shook her head. "I think if you marry me first, Cross loses his leverage over me and gains a reason to negotiate with you. You'd have a legal tie to the debt, which means he'd have to deal with you directly, instead of through threats. And you'd have access to the bank records I can see, which might show you how he's moving money to pay off Halloran." It was a desperate plan, half-formed and full of holes, but Harlan didn't dismiss it. Instead, he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a clerk or a debtor's daughter, but as someone who'd just offered to step into a fight that wasn't hers. "Why would you do that?" he asked quietly. Clara felt heat rise in her face. "Because I'm tired of being helpless," she said. "Because I've spent 2 years keeping my head down, and it hasn't made the debt go away. And because if Cross takes your ranch, he'll just move on to the next family, and the next, and no one will stop him." Harlan was silent for a moment, and then he said, "You understand what you're offering. A marriage bargain. You'd be bound to a man you don't know, on a ranch that might not exist in 2 weeks, with a debt that could follow us both." Clara lifted her chin. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" Harlan looked at Pruitt. "Can you draft a marriage contract by tonight?" he asked. Pruitt blinked rapidly. Yes, I suppose. But Mr. Briggs, this is highly irregular." Harlan cut him off. "I needed to state that Clara Tanner's family debt becomes my responsibility upon marriage, and that any claims against her person are void. I also need a clause that gives her half ownership of Whisper Ranch if I die or disappear. Can you do that?" Pruitt nodded weakly. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack a rib. Harlan turned back to her and said, "If we do this, it's real. I won't lie to a judge or a preacher, and I won't ask you to lie either. That means you'll be my wife in every legal sense, and I'll be your husband. I can't promise you safety, and I can't promise you comfort, but I can promise you won't face Cross alone again. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since the day her father sold their house and moved them into a boarding room above the bakery. She nodded once and said, "Then we have a deal." Harlan extended his hand, and she took it. His grip was warm and calloused and steady, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. Pruitt cleared his throat and said, "I'll have the contract ready by 8 o'clock. You'll need 2 witnesses for the marriage itself." Harlan released Clara's hand and said, "We'll find them." Then he looked at Clara and added, "You should know that the cattle drive leaves in 4 days. If we can't clear the deed by then, I'll have to sell the herd at a loss and start over. That means you'd be marrying a man with nothing but debts and a contested piece of land." Clara surprised herself by almost smiling. "That makes 2 of us," she said. Harlan's mouth curved just slightly, and she saw a flash of something that might have been humor or relief. He nodded toward the door. "I need to check the herd and get cleaned up," he said. "Meet me at the church at 8. Bring whatever you need for tonight, because after we sign, you're coming to the ranch." Clara's stomach flipped, but she nodded. "I'll be there," she said. Harlan put his hat back on, nodded once to Pruitt, and walked out. The door clicked shut, and Clara stood in the sudden quiet, her hand still warm from his grip. Pruitt was staring at her like she'd just announced she was joining the circus. "Miss Tanner," he said faintly, "are you certain about this?" Clara picked up her ledger and tucked it under her arm. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." She walked out into the dusty street and felt the late afternoon sun on her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of just running away. She had 4 hours to pack her life into a single bag, tell her landlady she was leaving, and meet a man she barely knew at a church to sign a contract that might save them both or destroy them completely. She started walking toward the boarding house, her heart still racing, and tried not to think about the look in Harlan's eyes when he'd promised she wouldn't face Cross alone. The boarding house was a narrow 2-story building that smelled like bread and lye soap, and Clara climbed the back stairs to the tiny room she shared with her younger sister, Anne. Anne was sitting on the edge of the bed mending a torn hem, and she looked up with a smile that faded the moment she saw Clara's face. "What happened?" Anne asked, setting down the needle. Clara closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. "I'm getting married tonight," she said. Anne's mouth fell open. Clara held up a hand before her sister could speak. "It's a business arrangement," she said. "A surveyor named Harlan Briggs needs help fighting a land claim, and I need a way out from under Father's debt. We're signing a contract at 8 o'clock, and then I'm moving to Whisper Ranch." Anne stood up slowly. "Clara, you can't," she said. "You don't know this man. What if he's dangerous? What if Cross retaliates?" Clara pushed off the door and started pulling her spare clothes from the trunk at the foot of the bed. "Cross is already retaliating," she said. "He's going after anyone who might challenge him. And Harlan's next. If I do nothing, Cross wins and we stay trapped. If I do this, at least we have a chance." Anne crossed the room and grabbed Clara's wrist. "And what about you? she said. What if this man expects things from you that you can't give? Clara met her sister's eyes and saw the fear there, the same fear she'd been carrying for months. Harlan promised it's a legal arrangement, she said quietly. He won't force anything. And if he tries, I'll leave. Anne's grip loosened, but didn't let go. You don't know that, she whispered. Clara pulled her hand free gently and folded a shawl into the bag. I don't, she admitted. But I know what happens if I stay here. Cross will keep circling, and eventually he'll find another way to corner me. At least this way I'm choosing the risk. Anne sank back onto the bed, her face pale. Clara knelt in front of her and took both her hands. I need you to stay here and keep working at the bakery, she said. Send word if Cross or his men come looking for me. And if anything happens, if I send you a message that says come now, you take the first stage out of town and go to Aunt Millicent in Denver. Do you understand? Anne nodded, tears spilling over. Clara squeezed her hands once and stood, her throat tight. She finished packing in silence, folding her 2 dresses, her nightgown, her mother's silver hairbrush, and the small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. Everything she owned fit into a canvas travel bag that had seen better days. She changed into her better dress, a dark blue cotton with a high collar and long sleeves, and pinned her braid into a coil at the nape of her neck. Anne helped her fasten the buttons down the back, and when Clara turned around, her sister's face was streaked with tears, but her chin was set. You're braver than I am, Anne said quietly. Clara shook her head. I'm just more desperate, she said. She kissed her sister's forehead, picked up her bag, and walked out before she could change her mind. The church was at the north end of town, a simple white building with a wooden cross above the door and a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left. Clara arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Harlan was already there, standing on the steps in a clean shirt and a dark vest, his hat in his hands. He'd shaved, and without the trail dust and stubble he looked younger, though the tired lines around his eyes remained. He saw her and straightened, and she saw something like relief cross his face. Clara climbed the steps, her bag heavy in her hand, and stopped in front of him. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said quietly. Clara lifted her chin. I said I would, she replied. Harlan nodded slowly. That's good to know, he said, and there was a weight to the words that told her he'd been testing her. Pruitt arrived moments later, with the contract rolled under his arm, and 2 witnesses in tow, a middle-aged couple Clara recognized from the general store. The preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Gill, ushered them all inside. The church was dim and smelled like candle wax and old wood, and Clara's footsteps echoed as they walked toward the altar. Reverend Gill lit 2 candles and opened his Bible, and Pruitt unrolled the contract on a small table near the front pew. Clara read it over carefully, her banker's eye catching every clause. It was exactly as Harlan had requested, her family's debt transferred to him upon marriage, all claims against her person voided, and half ownership of Whisper Ranch granted to her in the event of his death or disappearance. At the bottom was a line for her signature and a line for his. She looked up and found Harlan watching her. Any questions? He asked. Clara hesitated, then said, What happens if we can't clear the deed? If Cross wins? Harlan's expression didn't change. Then we start over, he said. I'll find other work, and you'll have your half of whatever's left. But I don't plan on losing. Clara believed him, not because he sounded confident, but because he sounded like a man who'd lost too much already and refused to lose again. She picked up the pen, dipped it in the ink, and signed her name in careful script. Harlan signed next, his handwriting blocky and sure. Pruitt and the witnesses added their signatures below, and just like that, Clara Tanner became Clara Briggs. Reverend Gill performed the ceremony quickly and without flourish, his voice steady, as he spoke the familiar words about love and honor and commitment. Clara's hands shook as Harlan slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. A ring he must have bought in the last few hours, because it fit almost perfectly. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss your bride," Harlan hesitated, and Clara saw the question in his eyes. She nodded once, and he leaned in and kissed her gently. Just a brief press of lips that tasted like uncertainty and promise. Then it was over. The witnesses congratulated them with bemused smiles. Pruitt handed Harlan a sealed copy of the contract, and Clara found herself standing in the church aisle as a married woman, her heart pounding and her mind racing. Harlan offered her his arm, and she took it. They walked out into the cool night air, and he led her to a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. He helped her up onto the bench seat and set her bag in the back, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "The ranch is about an hour out," he said. "We'll get there after full dark, but there's a good moon tonight." Clara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Harlan clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward, their hooves clopping softly on the packed dirt road. The town fell away behind them, and soon there was nothing but open land and stars and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. They rode in silence for a long time, and Clara used the quiet to steady herself. She glanced at Harlan's profile, trying to read him, but his expression was closed. Finally, she said, "Why did you agree to this? You could have fought Cross on your own." Harlan was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because I'm tired of fighting alone. I've spent the last 5 years trying to build something that lasts. And every time I get close, someone tries to take it. I figured if I was going to lose, I'd rather lose trying something different." Clara felt a strange kinship in those words. "And if we win," she asked, "what then?" Harlan glanced at her, and in the moonlight his tired eyes looked almost gentle. "Then we figure out what comes next," he said. "One day at a time." Clara nodded and turned her gaze back to the road. The night was cold, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Harlan noticed and reached behind the seat, pulling out a wool blanket. He draped it over her lap without a word, and she murmured a thank you. The kindness felt almost jarring after the tension of the day, and she realized, with a start, that she knew almost nothing about this man she'd just married. "What were you doing before you came here?" she asked. Harlan's jaw tightened. "Surveying for the railroad," he said, "until I realized they were using my maps to steal land from homesteaders. I quit, bought Whisper Ranch with everything I had saved, and swore I'd never work for them again. And now they're coming for your land anyway," Claire said quietly. Harlan nodded. "Seems I can't outrun them," he said, "so I'll have to go through them instead." The ranch appeared as a dark shape against the horizon, a low house with a barn and a corral beside it. Harlan drove the wagon up to the house and set the brake, then jumped down and came around to help Clara. She took his hand and stepped down, her legs stiff from the ride. The house was small, but solid, with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Harlan unlocked the door and lit a lamp, and warm yellow light spilled into the single main room. There was a fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, a stove, and a narrow bed in the corner. Clara's stomach tightened because there was only one bed, and she realized she hadn't thought this through. Harlan saw her expression and said quickly, "You take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn." Clara shook her head. "This is your house," she said. "I'm not putting you out." Harlan set her bag on the table and rubbed the back of his neck. "We're both tired," he said. "Let's not argue about it tonight. You take the bed, and tomorrow we'll figure out a better arrangement." Clara wanted to protest, but the exhaustion was catching up with her, and she nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Harlan picked up the lamp and a blanket and headed for the door, then paused and looked back. "Lock this behind me," he said. "If you hear anything at all, you fire the rifle that's above the door and I'll come running." Clara's pulse kicked. "You think Cross will come here tonight?" she asked. Harlan's expression was grim. "I think he'll hear about the marriage by morning," he said. "And I think he won't like it." He left, and Clara locked the door behind him. She stood in the quiet room, her heart still pounding, and tried to process everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. She'd gone from bank clerk to married woman, from powerless to armed, from trapped to terrified, but moving forward. She changed into her nightgown, washed her face in the basin on the washstand, and climbed into the narrow bed. The mattress was thin, but clean, and the blankets smelled like sage and wood smoke. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside, and despite her exhaustion, sleep was a long time coming. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats and sat up with her heart in her throat. Pale gray dawn light filtered through the window, and the hoofbeats were getting closer. Clara scrambled out of bed, pulled on her dress over her nightgown, and reached for the rifle above the door. It was heavier than she expected, and her hands shook as she checked to make sure it was loaded. The hoofbeats stopped outside, and a man's voice called out, "Briggs, I know you're in there." Clara's breath caught because she recognized that voice. Gideon Cross. She heard the barn door creak open, and then Harlan's voice, low and steady. "What do you want, Cross?" Clara moved to the window and peered out through the gap in the curtain. Cross was a tall man in an expensive coat and a flat-brimmed hat, sitting on a black horse that looked too fine for ranch work. 2 men flanked him, both armed. Harlan stood in front of the barn in his shirt sleeves, his face calm, but his posture tense. Cross smiled, and it was the same smile Clara remembered from the day he'd come to collect her father's debt. "I hear congratulations are in order," Cross said. "You married the Tanner girl. That's bold, Briggs. Stupid, but bold." Harlan didn't react. "The marriage is legal and recorded," he said. "Clara's debt is mine now, and any claims you had on her are void." Cross's smile widened. "Is that so?" he said. "Well, I suppose I'll have to take that up with you instead. But first, let's talk about that deed." Harlan crossed his arms. "There's nothing to talk about," he said. "The deed is mine, the survey is accurate, and your claim won't hold up in any honest court." Cross leaned forward in his saddle. "Good thing Judge Halloran isn't what you'd call honest then," he said. But here's the thing, Briggs. I don't actually care about your little patch of land. What I care about is the railroad route. And your ranch sits right in the path of the most profitable stretch. So here's my offer. You sign the deed over to me. I pay you half what it's worth. And you and your new bride ride off into the sunset. Everyone wins. Harlan's jaw tightened. And if I say no? He asked. Cross shrugged. Then I take it anyway, he said. And you lose everything, including the girl. Clara's hands tightened on the rifle. She wanted to step outside, to tell Cross exactly what she thought of his threats. But something held her back. Harlan was handling this, and if she rushed out now, she might make it worse. Harlan said quietly, I'm not signing anything, Cross. You want this land, you'll have to take it through the courts, and I'll fight you every step of the way. Cross's smile vanished. You're making a mistake, he said. Harlan didn't flinch. I've made plenty, he said. One more won't kill me. Cross stared at him for a long moment, and then he turned his horse sharply. You've got until the end of the week, he said over his shoulder. After that, I stopped playing nice. He spurred his horse and rode off, his two men following. Harlan stood watching until they were out of sight, and then he turned and walked toward the house. Clara set the rifle down with shaking hands and opened the door. Harlan stopped when he saw her, and his expression softened just slightly. You should have stayed inside, he said. Clara shook her head. I heard everything, she said. He means it, Harlan. He'll come after us. Harlan stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. I know, he said. That's why we need to move fast. I'm riding into town this morning to talk to the bank about Cross's accounts. If I can prove he's bribing Halloran, I can get the claim thrown out before it goes to trial. Clara's mind raced. I can help, she said. I have access to the bank records. If Cross has been moving large sums, I'll be able to trace them. Harlan studied her. That's dangerous, he said. If Cross finds out you're digging into his accounts, he'll retaliate. Clara met his eyes. He's already retaliating, she said. At least this way I'm doing something useful. Harlan was silent for a moment, and then he nodded. All right, he said. But we do this together. No going off on your own. Clara felt a flicker of warmth in her chest because he'd said we, not you. She nodded. Together, she agreed. They rode into town an hour later, Clara on the wagon bench beside Harlan. The morning was cold and clear, and the town was just beginning to stir when they arrived. Harlan left the wagon at the livery and walked with Clara to the bank, a stolid brick building on Main Street. The manager, a balding man named Howell, looked up in surprise when they entered. Miss Tanner, he said, and then his eyes flicked to Harlan, and understanding dawned. Mrs. Briggs now, I hear. Congratulations. Clara forced a polite smile. Thank you, Mr. Howell, she said. I need to review some account records. Howell's smile faltered. What kind of records? He asked carefully. Clara kept her voice steady. Transfer records for the past 6 months, she said. Specifically, large deposits or withdrawals associated with Gideon Cross. Howell's face went pale. Mrs. Briggs, I'm not sure that's appropriate, he said. Those are private accounts. Clara leaned on the counter. Mr. Howell, I've been a clerk here for 2 years, she said. I know exactly what's appropriate. And I know that if you refuse, I can file a formal request with the Territorial Banking Commission, which will take weeks, and raise questions you probably don't want raised. Howell glanced nervously at Harlan, who stood silent and imposing behind Clara. Howell swallowed. "I'll need to see a legal justification," he said weakly. Harlan stepped forward and placed the marriage contract on the counter. "My wife's family debt is now legally mine," he said. "That gives me standing to review any accounts connected to that debt." Howell picked up the contract with trembling fingers and read it over. Then he set it down and said, "Wait here." He disappeared into the back room, and Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Harlan touched her elbow lightly. "You did well," he said quietly. Clara glanced at him and saw approval in his tired eyes, and something warm unfurled in her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me." Harlan's mouth curved just slightly. "You're the one taking the risk," he said. "I'm just along for the ride." Howell returned with a thick ledger and set it on the counter with a thump. "You have 1 hour," he said. "And if Cross finds out I let you see this, I'll deny it." Clara nodded and opened the ledger, her practiced eyes scanning the columns of figures. Harlan leaned over her shoulder, and together they worked through the entries. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. 3 large deposits into Cross's account over the past 4 months, each one followed within days by a matching withdrawal. And each withdrawal corresponded to a date when Judge Halloran had ruled in Cross's favor on a land dispute. Clara's pulse quickened. "This is it," she said quietly. "This proves the bribes." Harlan straightened. "Can you make a copy?" he asked. Clara nodded and pulled out a blank sheet of paper, quickly transcribing the relevant entries with precise handwriting. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Howell hovered nearby, wringing his hands. "Are we done?" he asked. Clara closed the ledger and pushed it back across the counter. "We're done," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Howell." They left the bank and walked quickly toward the lawyer's office, but halfway there, a man stepped out of an alley and blocked their path. Clara's heart jumped because it was one of Cross's men. A lean man with a scar across his cheek and a revolver on his hip. "Mr. Cross would like a word," the man said, his hand resting casually on his gun. Harlan moved in front of Clara, his body a wall between her and the threat. "Tell Cross if he wants to talk, he can find me at the ranch," Harlan said evenly. The man smiled without humor. "He said you'd say that," he said. "He also said to remind you that accidents happen, especially to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." Clara felt ice slide down her spine. Harlan didn't move, but his voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. "You tell Cross that if anything happens to my wife, I'll make sure every judge and lawman in the territory knows exactly how he's been spending his money." The man's smile faded. He stared at Harlan for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You've been warned," he said. Harlan took Clara's arm and led her past the man, his grip firm but not painful. They walked quickly to Pruitt's office and slipped inside, and only then did Harlan let out a slow breath. Clara's hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against her skirt to steady them. "That was too close," she said. Harlan nodded. "We need to move faster," he said. "If Cross is sending his men after us in broad daylight, he's more desperate than I thought." Pruitt looked up from his desk, startled by their entrance. "Mr. Briggs, Mrs. Briggs," he said. "What's happened?" Harlan pulled the folded paper from Clara's pocket and handed it to Pruitt. "Proof that Cross has been bribing Judge Halloran," he said. 3 deposits, 3 rulings, all within days of each other. Pruitt unfolded the paper and read it, his eyes widening. This is highly irregular, he said. If we present this to the territorial marshal, Halloran could be removed from the bench. Harlan leaned on the desk. How long will that take? He asked. Pruitt hesitated. A week, maybe 2, he said. We'd need to file a formal complaint, gather testimony, and wait for the marshal to investigate. Harlan's jaw tightened. I don't have 2 weeks, he said. The cattle drive leaves in 3 days. If I don't move the herd by then, I lose everything. Clara spoke up. What if we bypass Halloran altogether? She said. If we can get the case moved to a different judge, Cross loses his leverage. Pruitt frowned. That would require proving that Halloran is compromised, he said. Which brings us back to the same problem. Clara shook her head. Not if we go public, she said. If we publish these figures in the town paper, Halloran will have no choice but to recuse himself or face public scandal. And Cross won't be able to retaliate without admitting his involvement. Pruitt and Harlan both stared at her. Harlan said slowly, That's risky. If it backfires, Cross will come after us with everything he has. Clara lifted her chin. He's already coming after us, she said. At least this way we control the timing. Harlan looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. All right, he said. Let's do it. Pruitt pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began drafting a notice for the paper, listing the deposits, the withdrawals, and the corresponding rulings. Clara added details about the account numbers and dates, and within an hour they had a document that was damning in its clarity. Pruitt sealed it and said, I'll take this to the editor myself. It should be in tomorrow's edition. Harlan shook his hand. Thank you, he said. Pruitt looked at Clara and added, You're a brave woman, Mrs. Briggs. Clara managed a tight smile. I'm a desperate woman, she said. There's a difference. They left Pruitt's office and walked back to the wagon in tense silence. The town felt different now, charged with danger, and Clara kept glancing over her shoulder. Harlan helped her onto the wagon bench and climbed up beside her, taking the reins. As they rolled out of town, Clara said quietly, Do you think it will work? Harlan was silent for a moment. I think it will force Cross to show his hand, he said. Whether that works in our favor or not, I can't say. But at least we're not waiting around to be ambushed. Clara nodded and pulled her shawl tighter. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride in, and by the time they arrived, the sun was high and hot. Harlan unhitched the horses and led them to the corral, while Clara went inside to start a fire in the stove. Her hands were steadier now, and she moved through the unfamiliar kitchen with a kind of grim efficiency. She found cornmeal, bacon, and a jar of preserved peaches, and by the time Harlan came back in, she had a simple meal laid out on the table. He washed his hands in the basin and sat down, and they ate in silence. Finally, Harlan said, You don't have to stay here, you know. If you want to go back to town, to your sister, I'll understand. Clara set down her fork and looked at him. Is that what you want? She asked. Harlan shook his head. No, he said. But I don't want you to stay out of obligation. Or fear. Clara took a breath. I'm not staying out of obligation, she said. I'm staying because I chose this. Because I'm tired of running, and because I think we might actually have a chance if we work together. Harlan held her gaze, and something in his tired eyes softened. All right, he said quietly. Then we see it through. Clara nodded, and for the first time since the wedding, she felt like they were on the same side of something, instead of just two people trapped in the same corner. They finished the meal, and Harlan went out to check the fences while Clara cleaned up. She was drying the last plate when she heard hoofbeats again, and her stomach dropped. She grabbed the rifle and ran to the window. But this time, it wasn't Cross. It was a single rider, a young man in a worn jacket and a battered hat. Harlan met him in the yard, and they spoke briefly before the rider handed over a folded paper and rode off. Harlan walked back to the house, his face grim. Clara opened the door. "What is it?" she asked. Harlan unfolded the paper and read it, then handed it to her. "It's from Pruitt," he said. The paper published the notice an hour ago. Judge Holleran has recused himself from the case, and it's been reassigned to Judge Morrison in the next county. Clara felt a surge of hope. "That's good, isn't it?" she asked. Harlan's expression didn't change. "It's good if we can get to Morrison before Cross does," he said. "But Morrison is 3 days' ride from here, and the cattle drive leaves tomorrow." Clara's hope faltered. "So what do we do?" she asked. Harlan folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. "We split up," he said. "I'll take the herd north and meet the buyers at the railhead. You take the deed and the evidence to Judge Morrison and make sure he rules in our favor before Cross can get to him." Clara's pulse kicked. "Harlan, that's..." She started, but he cut her off. "I know it's dangerous," he said, "but it's the only way. If we both go with the herd, Cross will steal the deed while we're gone. If we both go to Morrison, the herd will scatter and I'll lose the buyers. This is the only play we have." Clara's throat tightened because she knew he was right, but the thought of riding alone into contested territory made her stomach twist. "What if Cross sends men after me?" she asked. Harlan crossed to the corner of the room and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a modest stack of bills and a second revolver, smaller than his but clean and well-maintained. He handed her the gun and the money. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. Clara nodded. "My father taught me when I was 12, she said. Harlan's mouth curved slightly. "Good," he said. "Keep the gun loaded and stay on the main roads. If anyone follows you, don't try to outrun them. Find the nearest town and get help." "And Clara?" She looked up. "Trust your instincts," he said. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." Clara took the gun and the money, her hands steady now. "When do I leave?" she asked. Harlan glanced out the window at the sinking sun. "Tomorrow at first light," he said. "I'll ride with you as far as the junction, and then we go our separate ways." Clara nodded and tried not to think about how much could go wrong in 3 days. That night, they worked together to prepare for the journey, packing food, checking gear, and going over maps by lamplight. Harlan showed her the route to Morrison's town, marking safe places to stop and warning her about stretches where bandits sometimes worked. Clara listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. When the lamp burned low, Harlan insisted she take the bed again, and this time she was too exhausted to argue. She woke before dawn to the sound of Harlan moving quietly around the main room. She dressed quickly and found him by the stove, frying bacon and heating coffee. He handed her a tin cup, and she wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. They ate in silence, and then Harlan saddled 2 horses, a sturdy mare for Clara and his own gelding. He helped her mount, adjusted her stirrups, and tied her travel bag and the leather pouch with the deed securely behind her saddle. The sky was just beginning to lighten when they rode out, the air cold and sharp. They reached the junction as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the hills in shades of gold and rose. Harlan reined in and turned to face her. "This is where we split," he said. Clara nodded, her throat tight. Harlan reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. 3 days, he said. "I'll meet you at Morrison's office on the 4th day. If I'm not there by noon, you file the deed anyway and get yourself somewhere safe." Clara squeezed his hand. "You'll be there," she said. Harlan's mouth curved slightly. "I will," he said. "And Clara?" She looked at him. "You're stronger than you think," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara felt something crack in her chest, something warm and frightening and real. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Harlan released her hand, tipped his hat, and turned his horse north. Clara watched him ride away until he was just a dark shape against the morning light. And then she turned her mare east and urged her into a steady trot. The first day passed without incident. She stopped at a small settlement at midday to water the horse and buy bread and cheese. And she kept moving until the sun began to set. She made camp in a dry wash, built a small fire, and slept with the revolver under her blanket. The second day was harder. The road grew rougher, and by afternoon she was riding through broken country with sharp rocks and stunted trees. She saw no one, which should have been a relief, but instead made her more nervous. On the 3rd day, she was an hour from Morrison's town when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She glanced back and saw 2 riders, both moving fast. Her pulse spiked. She urged the mare into a gallop, but the horse was tired and the riders were gaining. Clara's mind raced. She was still half a mile from town, too far to outrun them. She veered off the road and headed for a stand of rocks, hoping for cover. The mare stumbled, and Clara nearly lost her seat. She pulled the horse to a stop behind the rocks and slid down, grabbing the revolver from her bag. The riders pulled up on the road, scanning the area. One of them pointed toward the rocks, and they started forward. Clara's hands shook as she cocked the revolver. She stepped out from behind the rocks and aimed the gun at the lead rider. "Stop right there," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The riders pulled up, and Clara's stomach dropped because she recognized the scarred man from town. He smiled slowly. "Mrs. Briggs," he said. "Fancy meeting you here." Clara kept the gun level. "Turn around and ride back," she said. "I'm not asking twice." The scarred man laughed. "Mr. Cross said you had spirit," he said. "But he also said to bring you back. Dead or alive, he didn't much care which." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. The scarred man's smile faded. He started to reach for his gun, and Clara fired. The shot went wide, but it spooked the horses, and the riders had to fight to keep control. Clara fired again, and this time the bullet kicked up dust near the scarred man's horse. He cursed and wheeled his mount around. "You'll regret that," he shouted. Clara stood her ground, the gun still raised, and watched as the 2 men rode back the way they'd come. Her hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped the revolver. She leaned against the rocks and took several deep breaths, trying to steady herself. Then she holstered the gun, climbed back on the mare, and rode hard for town. She reached Morrison's office just as the sun set, her clothes dusty and her face drawn. The judge was a gray-haired man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to her story, examined the deed and the evidence, and then nodded slowly. "This is serious," he said. "I'll issue a ruling first thing in the morning. But Mrs. Briggs, you should know that if Cross is willing to send armed men after you, he won't stop just because I rule against him." Clara lifted her chin. "I know," she said. "But at least the law will be on our side." Morrison's mouth curved slightly. "That's more than most people have," he said. He offered her a room at the boarding house next door, and Clara accepted gratefully. The next morning, Morrison issued his ruling. The deed to Whisper Ranch was valid, Cross's claim was dismissed, and Judge Halloran was formally censured for accepting bribes. Clara clutched the signed order like it was a lifeline and rode back toward the ranch, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She reached the junction at noon on the fourth day, but Harlan wasn't there. Clara's stomach tightened. She waited for an hour, then 2, her worry growing with every passing minute. Finally, she saw a rider coming from the north, and her heart leaped. But it wasn't Harlan. It was a young cowhand she didn't recognize. He pulled up and said, "Are you Mrs. Briggs?" Clara nodded. The cowhand handed her a folded note. "Mr. Briggs sent me," he said. "There was trouble with the herd. He's at the railhead, but he said to tell you he'll meet you at the train station in Juniper Valley tomorrow at dawn." Clara's hands shook as she unfolded the note. It was Harlan's handwriting, blocky and sure. "Clara, the buyers tried to back out. I had to renegotiate, and it took longer than expected. The herd is sold, and the money is safe, but I won't make it back to the ranch before the train leaves. If you got the ruling, meet me at the station tomorrow. If you didn't, don't wait for me. Go somewhere safe and start over. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Harlan." Clara folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She thanked the cowhand, turned her mare toward Juniper Valley, and rode through the night. She arrived at the station just as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The platform was nearly empty, just a few passengers waiting for the morning train. Clara dismounted and tied her horse, then stood on the platform with the signed ruling in her hand, her eyes scanning the tracks. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam and a screech of brakes, and passengers began to disembark. Clara's heart pounded as she searched the crowd. And then she saw him. Harlan stepped down from the train, his dark jacket dusty and his hat pulled low, and his tired eyes found hers across the platform. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Harlan crossed the platform in long strides, and Clara met him halfway. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and relief in his face. "Did you get it?" he asked quietly. Clara held up the signed ruling. "Judge Morrison dismissed the claim," she said. "The ranch is ours." Harlan let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for days. "And you?" he asked. "Are you all right?" Clara nodded, and then, because she couldn't hold it back any longer, she said, "I was afraid you wouldn't come." Harlan reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. I told you I'd be here, he said. And I don't break my promises. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back. I know, she said. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear you say it. Harlan's expression softened. Clara, he said quietly, I know this started as a business arrangement, a way to survive. But somewhere in the last few days, it stopped being just that for me. I don't know if you feel the same, and I won't push you. But I need you to know that when I said those vows, I meant them. Clara's breath caught. She looked up at him, at the tired honesty in his eyes, and felt something settle into place in her chest. I meant them too, she said. And I don't want this to be just a business arrangement anymore. Harlan's mouth curved into the first real smile she'd seen from him, and he pulled her into his arms. Clara leaned into him, her face pressed against his chest, and felt the steady beat of his heart. The train whistle blew, and the conductor called for final boarding. Harlan pulled back slightly and looked down at her. We should go home, he said. Clara nodded, and together they walked off the platform, hand in hand, toward the life they'd fought for and the trust they'd earned. The sun rose over Juniper Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and for the first time, in a long time, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.